For nearly a quarter century in Washington, one senator was known as much for a personal fact as for his politics. He never married. Lindsey Graham sat through 4 presidential campaigns of his own party, chaired 2 of the Senate's most powerful committees, and became one of the most quoted men in American foreign policy, all while fielding, again and again, the same question reporters couldn't resist asking. Who is Lindsey Graham really when the cameras are off? And why, in a city built on image and family photo ops, did he spend his entire adult life without a wife by his side? The senator himself gave a version of the answer years before his death, and it wasn't a joke, even though jokes were usually how he deflected the question in public. It's an answer rooted in a small South Carolina town, a family tragedy most people don't know the details of, and a promise made to an 11-year-old girl decades before he ever set foot in the United States Senate. This is that story, his and hers. Lindsey Olin Graham was born on July 9, 1955, in central South Carolina, a small blue-collar town in the upstate region. His parents, Florence James Graham and Millie Graham, ran a combination restaurant, bar, pool hall, and liquor store known locally as the Sanitary Cafe. It wasn't just where the family worked. For years, it was also where they lived. The Grahams occupied a small set of rooms behind the business itself before eventually moving next door once the business gained its footing. Graham grew up working in that pool hall alongside his parents, absorbing the rhythms of a small-town southern business from an early age. It was a childhood built on labor, not leisure, and it gave him an early education in dealing with all kinds of people, a skill that would serve him well decades later in a Senate chamber. He was the first person in his family to attend college, enrolling at the University of South Carolina with plans that, at the time, had nothing to do with national politics. Those plans were upended by tragedy before he'd even finished his degree. In 1976, when Graham was 20 years old, his mother died of Hodgkin lymphoma. 15 months later, his father died suddenly of a heart attack. Within little more than a year, Graham and his younger sister, Darlene, then just 13 years old, had lost both parents. There was no extended family structure waiting to absorb a grieving young teenager. There was a 20-something college student, still trying to finish his own education, and a little sister who now depended on him for everything. Rather than see Darlene sent to live with more distant relatives, Graham made the decision to keep her with him and raise her himself. After he finished his undergraduate degree and law school at the University of South Carolina, and after he enrolled in the Air Force Judge Advocate General's Corps, he legally adopted his own sister so she could be covered under his military health and family benefits. That decision meant balancing an intense legal career in uniform with the day-to-day realities of raising a teenager who had just lost both her parents, schoolwork, emotional support, the ordinary grind of parenting. All of it layered on top of a demanding career that would eventually stretch across 33 years of total Air Force service, including active duty, National Guard service, and time in the reserve. During part of that stretch, Graham was stationed at Rhein-Main Air Base in Germany, working as a military prosecutor and defense attorney, meaning he was, for a period, raising a teenage sister from across an ocean, leaning on family friends back in Central to help fill the gaps. Darlene has spoken about this dynamic herself, and not just in the aftermath of her brother's death. In a 2015 interview with CNN's Dana Bash, conducted after Graham launched his campaign for the 2016 Republican presidential nomination, she described just how far back his role as her caretaker actually went. Further back, even, than their parents' deaths. Even while their parents were alive, she explained, they worked such long and demanding hours running the family business that Lindsey was already functioning as a caregiver to her in practice, long before it became official in the eyes of the law. That bond stayed visible throughout his public life. When Graham announced his 2016 presidential run in Central, the town where he grew up, Darlene was there, and photographs from that day show the two of them embracing after his speech. A rare, unguarded moment for a candidate who usually kept his personal life out of the frame. With Darlene raised and his active duty service behind him, Graham moved into elected politics, working first as an assistant attorney for Oconee County, and then as city attorney for Central before winning a seat in the South Carolina House of Representatives in 1992. He moved to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1994 and then to the Senate in 2002, succeeding the long-serving Strom Thurmond. He won re-election in 2008, 2014, and again in 2020, and was serving his final term at the time of his death. Much of Graham's public identity was shaped by his friendship with Senator John McCain of Arizona. Alongside Senator Joe Lieberman, the two became known around Capitol Hill as the Three Amigos for their bipartisan work on defense and foreign policy. That friendship didn't end with McCain's death from brain cancer in 2018. Graham remained close to the McCain family for years afterward, a relationship McCain's daughter Meghan would later describe warmly in her own tribute after Graham's passing, recalling that he stayed in their lives long after the political spotlight had moved elsewhere. Graham's legislative record reflected the same instinct toward working across the aisle that defined his relationship with McCain. He partnered with the late Senator Ted Kennedy in the mid-2000s on comprehensive immigration reform, and later became one of the central Republican architects of the 2013 Gang of Eight immigration bill, a bipartisan effort that passed the Senate but stalled in the House. Both efforts drew heavy criticism from conservative activists who viewed any pathway to legal status as amnesty. Criticism Graham pushed back on by arguing that border security and an orderly legal immigration system were not competing goals, but complementary ones. On foreign policy, Graham built a reputation as one of the Senate's most reliable national security hawks. Drawing on his own background as an Air Force lawyer, he made repeated trips to Iraq and Afghanistan during those wars to meet with American troops and diplomats firsthand, and later became one of the strongest congressional voices supporting American assistance to Ukraine after Russia's 2022 invasion, visiting the country multiple times and meeting with its government officials. He was also an outspoken and long-standing critic of Iran's government, and he chaired the Senate Judiciary Committee from 2019 to 2021 before later chairing the Senate Budget Committee. Unlike almost every other senator with national ambitions, Graham never married and had no children, a fact that reporters and voters brought up constantly, especially during his brief run for the 2016 Republican presidential nomination, when questions about who might serve as First Lady became a recurring, half-joking fixture of his campaign coverage. Graham's public answer usually leaned on humor, but in his own 2015 memoir, released the same year he announced his presidential campaign, he offered something closer to a real explanation, even if it was still delivered with his characteristic self-deprecation. He wrote that he attributed never marrying partly to timing, that the right moment or the right person simply never quite lined up, and that he hadn't been lucky in that particular department of life. But he was careful to add that he didn't consider himself a man without a family. He had one. It just didn't look like the traditional version voters expected from a presidential candidate. That family, above everything else, was his sister. Darlene Graham Nordun spent most of her adult life out of the political spotlight, building a career centered on helping people with disabilities find employment and serving as a commissioner for the South Carolina Commission for the Blind. She married and raised a family of her own in South Carolina, staying close to the town where her brother had first taken on the job of raising her. When she spoke to CNN's Dana Bash in 2015, she didn't frame her brother's role in her life as some dramatic secret. She described it plainly, as a simple fact of how they grew up, that even before tragedy struck, before their parents' deaths made it official, Lindsey had already been acting as her caregiver, filling in the gaps left by parents who worked constant, exhausting hours to keep a small business running. Losing their parents didn't create that dynamic. It just made it permanent and made it his alone to carry. That framing matters because it reframes the question people spent decades asking. Why didn't he marry? Into something less about mystery and more about arithmetic. A 20-year-old college student inherited full responsibility for a 13-year-old sister at the exact moment most of his peers were beginning to think about dating, careers, and eventually families of their own. He spent the years that typically go toward courtship instead finishing law school, building a military legal career, and making sure his sister had stability. By the time that chapter of his life was behind him, he was already deep into a career, military service, then elected office, that left little room or little instinct for building a household of his own. Whether that was a conscious sacrifice or simply the shape his life took, Both he and his sister described it consistently for years, not as an absence, but as a different kind of family, built earlier and differently than most. By the time he reached the Senate, Graham had already built a reputation as someone unafraid of political discomfort, and that reputation only deepened over 2 decades in Washington. As chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee from 2019 to 2021, he presided over some of the most contentious confirmation fights in recent memory, playing a central role in seating a long line of federal judges during a period when control of the courts had become one of the sharpest battle lines in American politics. Supporters credited him with reshaping the federal judiciary for a generation. Critics accused him of moving too fast and too far to accommodate his party's priorities. Both reactions, in their own way, reflected the same reality, that Graham had become one of the most consequential Judiciary Committee chairs in modern Senate history, for better or worse, depending on who was asked. His relationship with Donald Trump followed one of the more dramatic arcs of any Republican in Congress. During the 2016 primary, Graham was among Trump's sharpest critics, at one point publicly calling him a race-baiting, xenophobic, religious bigot after Trump proposed banning Muslims from entering the country, a clash sharp enough that Trump responded by reading Graham's personal cell phone number aloud at a campaign rally. Yet in the years following John McCain's death in 2018, that relationship transformed almost completely. Graham became one of Trump's most reliable allies in the Senate, a shift that reshaped his political identity nearly as thoroughly as the loss of his parents had shaped his personal one decades earlier. By his final term, Graham was appearing regularly alongside Trump, backing his legislative priorities and drawing the president's public endorsement for re-election. His foreign policy instincts remained remarkably consistent even as his domestic political alliances shifted. He was one of the loudest congressional voices pushing for a tougher American posture toward Iran's government, arguing for years that the United States needed to be prepared to confront Tehran's nuclear ambitions directly rather than negotiate around them. He traveled to Munich for security conferences, met with Ukrainian officials on the ground in Kyiv even as the war there dragged on, and consistently framed American support for allies abroad, whether Ukraine, Israel, or NATO more broadly, not as generosity, but as strategic self-interest. It was a philosophy that made him one of the most quoted senators on cable news for the better part of 2 decades, regardless of which party controlled the White House. None of that public record, though, ever fully displaced the personal question that followed him. Interviewers circled back to it again and again across 3 decades, in profiles during his 2016 campaign, in retrospectives during his later Senate terms, and finally in the obituaries written the week he died. It became, in its own strange way, as much a part of his public identity as any piece of legislation he authored. While her brother's career unfolded in Washington, Darlene Graham nor done built a quieter, but no less committed career of her own in South Carolina. She spent years working to help people with disabilities find employment, and she served as a commissioner for the South Carolina Commission for the Blind, work rooted in the same instinct toward caretaking that had defined her relationship with her brother since childhood. She married and raised her own family, staying rooted in the upstate region where she and Lindsey had grown up together, and she remained a steady, low-profile presence at his campaign events over the years, including during his 2016 presidential run. That low profile changed abruptly in July 2026. Within days of losing the brother who had raised her, she found herself being sworn in as a United States Senator, a role she had never sought and had no prior elected experience, stepping into a position that instantly made her the first woman ever to represent South Carolina in the chamber. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary turn for someone who had spent her adult life working in disability services rather than politics. But it was also, in its own way, consistent with everything she and her brother had built together since she was a teenager. When one of them needed the other to step up, the other one did. Senator Lindsey Graham died on Saturday, July 11, 2026, at the age of 71, after what his office described as a brief and sudden illness. He had recently returned from a trip to Ukraine, and by his own account to President Trump, who spoke with him by phone hours before his death, he was simply tired, nothing more. A preliminary finding from the District of Columbia Medical Examiner's office pointed to an aortic dissection connected to underlying heart disease as the cause, a condition that can develop silently for years before becoming fatal without warning. Tributes arrived quickly and from across the political spectrum. President Trump, who had grown close to Graham in the years since John McCain's death, called him one of the greatest people and senators he had ever known and described their final phone call. Senate colleagues from both parties spoke to his decades of relationships built across the aisle, from his work with Ted Kennedy on immigration to his 3-decade friendship with McCain. Coverage of his death repeatedly returned to the same detail. He was the only sitting member of the Senate who had never married, a fact that had trailed him for nearly his entire career, and that took on new resonance once his family's history became part of his obituary. In the days after Graham's death, South Carolina Governor Henry McMaster faced the task of naming a replacement to serve out the remainder of his term. Republican leaders, including President Trump, quickly coalesced around an unusual but symbolically fitting choice: Darlene Graham Nordun, the sister Graham had raised and adopted more than 4 decades earlier. Trump publicly endorsed the idea, calling it a fitting tribute to a man who, in his words, loved her dearly. McMaster made the appointment official on July 13th, and Darlene Graham was sworn in on the Senate floor 2 days later, becoming the first woman ever to represent South Carolina in the United States Senate. Speaking to reporters after the announcement, she summed up the moment simply, that her brother had always been there for her, and that now it was her turn to be there for him, finishing the work he'd left undone. It closed a kind of circle that had opened 50 years earlier in the rooms behind a small-town bar in central South Carolina, when a college student barely out of his teens took on the job of raising his little sister, and never really put it down for the rest of his life. There's no scandal buried in Lindsey Graham's decision never to marry, and no secret relationship kept hidden from public view for decades. What emerges instead, from his own memoir and from his sister's own words, both in 2015 and in the days after his death, is something simpler and, in its own way, more affecting than any tabloid explanation could have been. Graham built a family early, at an age when most people are only beginning to think about what family might eventually look like for them. He built it out of necessity, in the aftermath of losing both parents within 15 months of each other, and he kept building it, through law school, through a military legal career that spanned 3 decades, through a Senate career defined by relationships that outlasted political convenience, right up until his sister stood on the floor of the Senate to finish the work he started. Every joke he made on the campaign trail about a rotating cast of potential first ladies sat on top of that same original decision, that raising his sister came first, and that everything else in his personal life was built, or left unbuilt, around that choice. It wasn't a mystery that needed decades to solve. It was a promise a 20-year-old made to